Flashing lights, fake cops, and a megaphone shouting for me to get on the ground right there in front of my own barn. They thought they were arresting some random rancher. They didn't know the man they were pointing guns at used to run the Justice Department for this entire state. By the time I showed them who I was, their little HOA empire had already started to crack. My name's Ethan Miles. I was the Attorney General of Texas, but these days I'm just a man who gets up before sunrise, feeds the hens, and tries to keep a promise I made to my wife, Peace. When Hannah and I left Austin, we swore we'd trade the courtroom chaos for quiet soil. 45 acres of freedom and a red barn that had stood longer than most folks around here had been alive. I told myself out here nobody cares who I used to be. Turns out, that was my first mistake. The trouble started with a car parked too long on the gravel road. Headlights off, engine humming, just sitting there in the mist. I waved neighborly, but the driver rolled away slow like he'd been caught watching something he shouldn't. A few nights later, Hannah said she heard a drone outside her window. I laughed it off, told her it was probably a kid testing a new toy. But that morning, when I saw a flash of metal above the tree line, I realized something people were watching us. That same week, I found a white envelope tucked in the gate. No stamp, no sender. Just my name written in thick black marker. Inside was a letter from the Oak Hollow Community Enforcement Division. Said my red barn violated visual compliance standards. I actually chuckled. That barn's been red since before their subdivision existed. Tossed the notice on the truck seat and forgot about it. But looking back now, that paper was the first warning shot. 2 days later, she showed up. Deborah Whitman, HOA, president of Oak Hollow. Mid-50s platinum hair and an ego that could fill a courthouse. She stepped out of her silver Lexus like she owned the road itself. "Mr. Miles," she said, "we need to discuss your non-compliance." I told her flat out, "Ma'am, this property isn't under your HOA jurisdiction." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Your red barn is visible from our main road. It breaks the uniform color standard. We expect a timely correction." I almost laughed. "If it offends your neutral palette, plant taller hedges." Behind her stood 2 others. Ken, her nervous vice president, and Sharon, head of the so-called security committee, scribbling in her little notebook like we were in court. Hannah came out, asked if there was a problem. Deborah's tone sharpened. "Only if your husband refuses to cooperate." I told her, calm as I could, "Unless you've got a court order, you're trespassing. Leave." She slid her sunglasses back on like armor and said, "You'll be hearing from our compliance division." Then she drove off, leaving a trail of dust and arrogance behind. I figured that was the end of it. It wasn't. Within a week, more letters arrived, thicker, more aggressive. Fines for unregistered fencing, improper livestock placement, non-neutral structures. I burned them in the fireplace that night. Watching that gold HOA seal curl in the flames felt good. But I knew better. People drunk on small power rarely stop after the first sip. Then came the stickers, bright orange ones slapped on my mailbox and back gate. Pending violation. Hannah peeled one off with shaking hands and said quietly, "They're not going to stop, are they?" "No," I told her, "and neither am I." The following morning, I caught Sharon parked across the road with binoculars pretending to birdwatch. That's when I realized the barn wasn't the issue. It was control. Someone like Deborah doesn't tolerate being told no. 2 days later, the rumble of engines rolled up my driveway. It was early sun, barely over the horizon. 3 vehicles came barreling through the dust, a black pickup and 2 old Crown Vics lights flashing. Out jump 3 men in black vests labeled Community Enforcement Division. No badges, no names, but enough fake authority to look dangerous. One shouted through a megaphone, "Ethan Miles. Get on the ground. You're under arrest for violating community safety codes and resisting HOA jurisdiction." I set down my feed bucket slowly. "You boys, sure you're on the right property?" Last warning, he barked. I pulled my phone out, hit record. Under Texas, Penal Code 37.12. "Impersonating a peace officer is a felony," I said, raising my voice. "You sure you want to keep playing cop on my land?" They hesitated. Then, out of nowhere, the sound of real authority, a sheriff's SUV roaring up the lane, dust flying. Sheriff Luke Donovan stepped out, one hand resting on his sidearm. "Drop the cuffs," he ordered. "You're trespassing and impersonating officers." The men froze. One stammered something about HOA compliance. Luke's tone went cold. "Wrong county, wrong badge. You're done." Within minutes, the imposters were cuffed and in the back of the cruiser. Down the road, I saw that same silver Lexus, watching from afar, Deborah's blonde hair glinting through the window. She didn't even flinch when I looked her way. Just drove off. That's when I realized this wasn't neighborly harassment anymore. It was war. Luke stayed after his deputies left. He leaned on his truck and said, "Deborah runs that HOA like her own little kingdom, but this time she's crossed into criminal." I nodded. Then, it's time to remind her who the law really belongs to. A week later, Deborah called an emergency HOA meeting. I wasn't a resident, but I went anyway. Hannah beside me, calm but watchful. Inside the hall, every neighbor's eye flicked between us and the board like spectators before a storm. Deborah stood behind her podium, crisp blazer microphone in hand. "We have a resident who continues to defy our regulations," she began, turning to me. "Mr. Miles refuses to comply with community standards." I stood up. "Ma'am, you sent 3 men with fake badges to my property. That's not enforcement, that's a felony. And the sheriff's got the proof." Murmurs spread through the crowd. One neighbor asked, "Is that true?" Deborah's voice wavered. "We hired an external team. They may have overstepped." Ken, her vice president, sank in his chair. Sharon looked pale. I took a step forward. "You call it overstepping. I call it criminal impersonation. This isn't about a barn anymore. It's about abuse of power." The room erupted. Deborah slammed her gavel, face red. Meeting adjourned. I left knowing the tide had turned. The crowd had seen the cracks in her mask. Over the next few days, the story hit the news. Retired state attorney general targeted by rogue HOA. Reporters lined up at the gate. Deborah went on TV pretending to be the victim. I didn't bother responding. Truth doesn't need a PR team. Instead, I took the evidence to Sarah Keene, an old colleague turned civil rights lawyer. She skimmed the forged notices, the sheriff's report, the photos, then looked up and said, "Ethan, this isn't harassment anymore. It's a conspiracy." She filed for a restraining order and a full investigation. Luke's audit team found missing HOA funds. Cash withdrawals, fake vendor pay. But power doesn't surrender quietly. One night, our lights went out. Not a flicker, just black. I stepped outside and saw Oak Hollow glowing bright across the fields while our line alone sat in darkness. Sabotage. Luke came within the hour. His deputy found a clean bolt cutter slice through the transformer line and a flyer stuck under my windshield, "HOA violator, do not approach." My face printed across it. Hannah whispered, "They're trying to turn the neighbors against us." Luke nodded. "Or scare you off. Either way, it ends tonight." We raided the HOA office that same night under warrant. Inside were files labeled Compliance Patrol, Cash Payout, Even Next Phase. Discreet. There was a USB drive labeled Drone Footage, East Fence. Luke just shook his head. They wrote their own convictions. I thought that was the final nail. I was wrong. 2 mornings later, I got an email. No sender, no subject. Just a video. The face on the screen made my stomach drop. Ronnie Chase. A political fixer I'd put away a decade ago. Smirking. "You took my life once, Miles," he said. "Now I'm taking yours one piece at a time." The camera turned my barn lit by moonlight. He'd been here. That night, I didn't sleep. Every noise outside felt like a gun cocking. Hannah sat beside me, her hand in mine, whispering, "We'll get through this." Then came the package. A brown box on the porch, no label. I called Luke. He told me not to touch it. 20 minutes later, the bomb squad robot carried it to the field. The explosion shook the windows. Smoke rose over the pasture like the devil himself had taken a breath. Luke looked at me afterward. "That wasn't HOA business," he said. "That was attempted murder." And just like that, fear turned to fury. I told him, "Then we'll end this in court my way." 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Cameras flashing, reporters crowding the steps. Deborah sat at the defense table, her platinum hair dulled under the fluorescent lights. Ronnie sat shackled behind her, smirk fading. Sarah stood cool and sharp. "This isn't neighborhood governance," she said to the jury. "This is organized intimidation and fraud." The sheriff's dash cam played on the screen, the fake cops shouting my calm refusal. Luke stepping in. The room fell silent. Then came the audit papers, the drone footage, the HOA payments leading straight to Ronnie's shell company. When I took the stand, I told them everything. The letters, the threats the night we nearly died because of a box on our porch. I looked right at Deborah and said, "You used fake power to control good people. But you forgot something the law doesn't answer to you." The verdict came fast. Guilty. On all counts. Fraud, conspiracy, impersonation, attempted murder. The judge dissolved Oak Hollow HOA that same day. The gavel echoed like thunder. When it was over, I didn't feel triumph. Just quiet. Like the land itself had finally exhaled. Because sometimes peace isn't given, it's reclaimed. And sometimes justice wears a cowboy hat